Today I'm painting up a classic 40k mini for one of the best painting competitions around. Welcome back to Anvil of Doom Miniatures. My name is Deets, and yes, it's that time of year again. It's time for Olden Demon. Now, if you can't guess what Olden Demon is by the name, it's essentially a painting competition for Oldhammer and is run by Olden Demon on YouTube. So after this video, make sure you go check his channel out. Now, if you're a long-term Anvil of Doom subscriber, you probably remember one of my first ever videos was painting up a miniature for the Olden Demon competition, which was this Warhammer Quest Wood Elf. Now, that was about a year ago, so that means the channel just hit its 1 year birthday, so happy birthday to the channel, and thanks so much for all your support. This year, the Olden Demon competition is a little bit different because it has two categories, sci-fi and fantasy. And I want to try enter both if I have time. Keywords are if I have time. For the sci-fi category, I've chosen this classic Ragnar Blackmane Space Wolf from 40k. It's an absolutely gorgeous mini and just screams like rock and roll. And if you want to see what I've chosen for my fantasy miniature, you're going to have to wait till next week. Now, my goal for this miniature is to make it look like something you would have seen out of a classic white dwarf magazine back in the day. That's what I'm really aiming for. I'm not really aiming to win the competition. I just want to have fun, paint something up, and really hit those retro vibes. Also, my dudes, just a quick FYI, this really isn't a tutorial. It's really just a video about my process. I tend to paint kind of sporadically from time to time, and for competitions and stuff like this, I just like to paint what I'm feeling, and if I get bored of something, I just move on. Space Wolves are a chapter of Space Marine that I tend to gravitate towards a little bit more, and I think that's because they're wild aesthetic. My original plan for this year's Olden Demon was to actually paint an Eldar model, but I really couldn't find a miniature that I liked on eBay or on Marketplace, so I might save that for next year. Now, after some quick prep, I gave him an undercoat of Wraithbone, and it was time to tackle that grumpy face. I like to paint my faces first, as they are generally the hardest part of the model to paint for me, and I like to get it out of the way nice and quick. Usually I would just highlight the raised areas, but as this guy is for a competition, I want to give him some real details, so I'm going to attempt to give the forehead some wrinkles, and I'm going to paint each eye and tooth as best as I can. Now, you can't call this guy Ragnar Blackmane and not give him black hair, so I just went over the hair with Abaddon Black. One of my challenges for this guy was obviously going to be his armor, as it was kind of tucked underneath everything, and it really made it hard to get to, so I'm going to tackle this first. This will be the fourth Space Marine I've ever painted, and for its armor, it's going to be pretty much trial and error. One thing about filming YouTube videos is that it can be pretty hard to paint at the best of your ability, all while making sure that everything is in focus, so I'll just show you my process on this dude's legs. I use Thunderhawk blue all over, making sure I go over all the recesses, as this will be my shadow color. Then I go over with a few thin coats of rust grey, making sure each panel is covered. Now it's time for the hard part, and it's time to glaze. I use a mix of rust grey and Fenrisian grey and glaze that about 2/3 of the panel, trying to make sure the transitions are as smooth as possible. Then I glaze pure Fenrisian grey to about half the panel, and then I mix in Fenrisian grey to Ulthuan grey and just glaze the top quarter of the panels. To blend this all together, I then mix in 6 parts contrast medium to 1 part rust grey and glaze this all over the armor. I've never attempted this before, but it works so damn well, I actually couldn't believe how good it all turned out. Next, I went back over with some severely watered down Dark Reaper to some of the panel recesses just to give some contrast, and finally I did an edge highlight to the panels with some Ulthuan grey, and also mixed a little bit of white to the Ulthuan grey and just did the tips and places light would hit. While painting this armor, I didn't know what I was doing, and I feel like I took a gamble and it really paid off. I'll definitely be doing this technique again soon. To fill in some of the gaps and to make this space chihuahua look a bit more complete, I slap on a mix of Evil Suns and Corn Red to the robes, sword hilt, and his little hair scrunchies. So to make my life even harder, I'm going to attempt another technique I really haven't tried that much before, and that is wet blending. Space Wolves enjoy wearing the skin of the animals they love, and these pelts can be pretty tricky. I used a base coat of bone white all over, and then tried wet blending some Xandri dust upwards towards the shoulder. I watered down the Xandri dust just a little bit for this, as I didn't want it to be too strong of a transition. I then glazed on some Mournfang brown to the main shoulder area, and then finished off with some severely watered down dried bark to the top. And to tie this pelt together, I used some contrast medium and Xandri dust all over. I then went around the pelt, hitting the hair with some Mournfang brown and some bone white just to highlight areas of interest. Now, I did go back later and fix a few bits and pieces up, but we don't have time for that. What we do have time for is a base coat of yellow with the best base coat color around, Bronze Flesh Tone by Vallejo Game Color. I'm the biggest simp for this paint. Make sure you go out and get it for your yellows, it works a treat. Now at this point I've actually had to put down the paintbrushes and travel to work for a few days, and it really did throw a spanner in the works. I thought I'd have more time to complete this guy, and he was taking a lot longer than what I actually first anticipated, and I really want to get moving on my fantasy miniature because that's the one I want to put the most time into, but as I said, I'm running out of time and I'm actually starting to panic a little bit here. Now to add to the panic, I didn't have my base coats or washes done yet, so I spent a long time going over the leathers, claws, all the golds and silver areas as carefully as I could. I like to paint in a 3-step process of a base, wash, highlight, as it pumps up my colours and gives me that Oldhammer look, which I really do find appealing. For Olden Demon, you don't have to paint with a classic style, it's more about bringing old minis to life with modern painting techniques, and if you take a look at last year's winners, you can see that it was a real mixed bag of painting styles. This is what I find fun about Olden Demon, you can paint how you like and you don't have to travel around the world to enter in it. Now last year I didn't place, but I had a ball painting up my entry, and this year I would love just to crack the top 10, but I've got a mountain to climb to get there. With that all down, it's time to highlight, and I'll tackle the reds first. I like to start off with glazing some Evil Sun Scarlet to build up that initial pop of vibrancy. I then mix in small amounts of Wild Rider Red to the Evil Suns until I get pure Wild Rider Red, and then it's time for a final edge highlight of Orange Flare. I do add a small amount of Uriel Yellow to the Orange Flare to the tips and corners to finish. Next up is the yellow, and I go back over with Bronze Flesh Tone, being super careful not to get any in the recesses or the features like the bolts around the gun. I want to keep these dark to improve the readability. I start glazing on my Uriel Yellow to the edges of the chainsword, fancy bits of armor, and his bolter. I then mix in some Dawn Yellow to the Uriel Yellow and hit it again, but cover less area, moving the paint towards the edges, and then it's time for a pure Dawn Yellow highlight, and I also do a dot of white and Dawn Yellow mix just to the tips. Now I'm trying to take as much time as I can doing this because if I make a mistake it's going to blow up my time frame. So those are my primary colours done, and it was a pretty big accomplishment to get them to the standard that I was happy with. Next up were the true metallics, and I spent another couple days powering through these, and the panic really did set in because at this point I was now 9 days out from the deadline and my fantasy entry is just sitting next to me screaming for some paint. Now early on in the process, while I was looking at a few images of this Ragnar Blackmane, I realized that the little wolf tassely tail under his bolter was missing, so I jumped on eBay and found a small one that was on like a little cloak that was going to fit this model just perfectly. I carefully trimmed it off the cloak with my snips and then removed the top chain part. Using my little hand drill, I made a really tiny hole on top of the tail and also under the gun handle, which was a really tricky spot to get to. It was then time for a lick of paint using the same techniques that I used for the pelt and also some gold true metallic metals. Then it was time to glue this sucker in place and it was job done. Now as I said a number of times in this video, time is absolutely against me with this guy and I really did want to paint up his banners, but unfortunately I am running a little behind. So what I'm going to do is create these banners in a program called Procreate. It's like a drawing app and it's really easy to use and you can pretty much do up any design on it. I wanted the Space Wolf logo to look absolutely perfect, so I'm just going to trace that off a decal I grabbed off the GW website, and for the other banner I just gave it a go drawing it myself and using the classic art as reference. Now if you want a bit more of an in-depth tutorial on how to do this on Procreate, I did actually make a video last year how to paint a white dwarf cover, which you can check out, and at the start of the video there's a short little guide on how I do this. So I'm going to get these banners printed out at my local print store, and I didn't really know the size, so I just did a PDF and rearranged a bunch of different sizes. And if you want this PDF, if you do collect Space Wolves and you want some of these banners, head on over to my Patreon. They're up there for free and you can just download them and use them for your army as well. It took me a couple of attempts to get these flags right, and I highly recommend making sure your workstation is clean before cutting these flags out, because I didn't realize old dry specks of paint would rub off on the paper. After they're all trimmed out, I used some clear glue to stick each side together, and then I used a black paint pen to color the edges black so no white paper was showing. I then super glued the banner onto the pole and wrapped the tabs around. This is the part where you need to be super careful because you only have one shot of this. Now I did rush a few things in the end, but if I do have time later next week, I'm just going to go over and touch a few things up. But anyway, my dudes, here it is. Here is my Olden Demon entry for 2024, a classic Space Wolf Ragnar Blackmane. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end, my dudes. Fingers crossed I can get my fantasy mini done in time for next week. So make sure you subscribe to the channel because I will be posting a video on my process for that, hopefully next week. Now, as I have hit the 1 year mark, I want to say a massive thank you to my Patreons. Thanks so much for the support, guys, and for believing in this channel. I really do appreciate it. And thank you to you guys out there as well for all your contributions to the channel, whether that be subscribing or liking. I appreciate that as well. Anyway, I'm out of here to start panic painting my fantasy miniature for next week's video, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers.